In the year 1761, North Germany bore witness to the start of an extraordinary tale. It introduced Charlotte, a princess hailing from a modest German province. In an initial scene, what she overheard from her brother drove her to destroy a nearby statue's bust. This emotional outburst was followed by a poignant farewell to the palace. Charlotte embarked on a journey alongside her brother, bound for Britain. There she was destined to marry King George III. Throughout the trip, she remained silent. It was her brother who eventually broke the ice, noting her statue-like stillness that had persisted for a full 6 hours. Her heavy dress, adorned with Indian rubies and delicate lace, and lining made of whalebones. Excessive movement risked damaging these extravagant adornments, and she lamented wearing them merely for the sake of appearing regal. Her brother acknowledged her distress, but reminded her of the great honor bestowed upon their family. Charlotte scoffed at the notion, believing she had been chosen primarily for her ability to bear children, her literacy, and her royal lineage, attributes she considered unremarkable. Her brother implored her to fulfill her duty to their homeland. Charlotte responded with a heavy silence, but sensing her melancholy, her brother apologized and gently suggested that life held challenges more agonizing than marrying the King of Britain. Reluctantly, Charlotte agreed to proceed with her responsibilities. Fast forward to 1817. Charlotte's anguish deepened when she received the heart-wrenching news that her only granddaughter had died during childbirth. Despite having borne 13 sons, Charlotte's joy of welcoming a legitimate grandchild into the world continued to elude her. Now let's rewind to 1761, the year when Charlotte first set foot in the palace. There, she was subjected to an examination at the hands of the Queen Mother. The Queen scrutinized Charlotte's physical attributes, inspecting her teeth and conducting a head-to-toe evaluation. Following this, the Queen Mother summoned Brimsley, instructing him to escort Charlotte to the tailor for her wedding dress fitting. Charlotte observed that Brimsley was shadowing her at an uncomfortably close distance. He clarified that his duty was to maintain a minimum 5-meter separation from her at all times. Despite her persistent queries about the king's whereabouts, her quest for answers remained unfulfilled. The Queen Mother convened with the nobles, expressing her reservations regarding Charlotte's darker complexion. Nevertheless, she was unwavering in her decision to proceed with the impending marriage. She issued instructions for the invitation of all dark-skinned individuals and set in motion the preparations for the wedding, a mere 6 hours away. Agatha, who was married to a wealthy man but did not love him, received an invitation to the king's wedding, even though she was already a member of the royal entourage. She spoke with the queen and was startled to learn that her husband had been granted the title of Lord. Brimsley went to the king's room and spoke with Reynolds, the king's bodyguard, informing him that Charlotte was missing. George, the king, overheard their conversation. Charlotte attempted to climb over a fence to escape. At this moment, George spotted her and offered his assistance. She graciously accepted, unaware that he was the king. However, he surprised her by introducing himself, leading Charlotte to feel embarrassed. Charlotte then asked George to share more about himself. He revealed his love for science and art, particularly his passion for astronomy. Amid their conversation, Charlotte's brother arrived, and George expressed his desire to see her again soon, leaving Charlotte with a newfound admiration for the king. Charlotte chose to wear the dress she brought with her for the marriage ceremony. As the ceremony began, she noticed judgmental glances from the attendees. Nevertheless, she strived to remain happy and focused her attention on George. After the ceremony, Charlotte and George danced together, appearing genuinely happy and enchanted by each other's company. Charlotte encountered Agatha, who introduced herself as a member of the royal entourage. She urged Charlotte to be cautious and promising to be there for her when needed. George and Charlotte embark on a ride in the royal chariot, where they greet well-wishers along the way. George eventually revealed the palace that would be Charlotte's future home. He left her with consternations and unanswered questions. In 1817, Charlotte's frustration boiled over. She's upset with her daughters, who are all unmarried except for one who is barren, and her sons, who are not married and have illegitimate children. Returning to 1761, we find Charlotte sad and alone in her room. The next day, eager to explore museums and engage in charitable activities, she asked Brimsley for her appointment list. To her disappointment, Brimsley informed her that she didn't have an appointment book because she was in the honeymoon period. Meanwhile, the Queen met with the House of Lords, where concerns about George's marriage and the need for a legitimate heir were raised. Charlotte found her days growing monotonous. Determined to see her husband at his palace, Charlotte instructed Brimsley to prepare her vehicle. She arrived at George's palace, surprising Reynolds, who informed her that George was in the astronomical observatory room. She questioned what she did to deserve this treatment, but George angrily ordered her to return to her palace. Upon knowing that the Queen Mother was following the news of the newlywed couple, Brimsley and Reynolds met privately and suggested that George should send gifts to Charlotte to improve her mood. Expressing his desire for Charlotte not to be lonely and bringing a smile to her face, George gifted her a rare breed of dog. However, when she received the gift he sent, she became disappointed and disgusted, describing it as a hideous rabbit. Brimsley arranged a meeting for Charlotte with Agatha, who was pleased to meet Charlotte in the palace. They met and Charlotte put a happy mask on her face, but Agatha saw through her facade and encouraged her to be herself. After dismissing the servants from her chamber, Charlotte confided in Agatha about her struggles. When Agatha asked if her marriage had been consummated, Charlotte was unsure of the meaning and was left perplexed. Agatha offered to teach her about marriage, but Charlotte protested that she didn't like George and wondered why she should learn from him. The worried queen summoned Agatha to her palace, wanting to know about any good news from Charlotte's end. Agatha seized the opportunity and requested the queen to grant her husband the title of lord and allow them to enter the royal society, as it would help her gain access to information in royal circles and among the wealthy. The queen reluctantly agreed to Agatha's requests. During breakfast, George had surprised Charlotte with a visit to her palace. Charlotte became angry and attempted to leave, but George urged her to stay and give him a chance to explain himself. He then took her to the astronomy observatory room, where Charlotte was fascinated by the sight of the planet Venus. George explained that he was studying the planet and shared his sense of insignificance in the vast universe, likening himself to a tiny dot in the world. George asked for a new start. Charlotte happily agreed, and George returned with her to the palace. That night, Charlotte and George consummated their marriage, sharing intimate moments. The next morning, Charlotte woke up feeling content and planned to have breakfast with George. However, she was surprised to learn that he was with his mother. She overheard George confessing that he consummated the marriage solely for the sake of the crown, claiming that he did everything for his country, even if that was against his desires. He believed he was born for this purpose. Charlotte, deeply saddened by what she heard, told Brimsley that she would have breakfast alone. On the day of the inauguration, Brimsley descended to the basements in search of the king. He discovered George with a doctor conducting examinations. When he questioned Reynolds, the latter refused to disclose any information and instructed Brimsley to pretend he saw nothing. Meanwhile, Agatha was preparing for the inauguration party when her husband suggested she ask the Mother Queen's support by hosting the dance party at their house. The Mother Queen was concerned about the possibility of Charlotte becoming pregnant to secure the dynasty's future. Turning the table for her advantage, Agatha suggested a dance party at her house. The Mother Queen decided to discuss the matter with the House of Lords. Meanwhile, Charlotte and George were crowned as king and queen before the public. Charlotte learned about George's secretive encounter with a doctor in the basement, which he explained as routine examinations for the inauguration. But Charlotte remained skeptical. In the royal society, it was evident that the white women were reluctant to attend Agatha's party. signaling their disapproval of the idea. What worsened the matter was the discontent from the House of the Lords regarding Agatha's party, and they requested the Queen to cancel it. Charlotte told George how much he was dedicated to the country, and George acknowledged that he was feeling like an object on display most of the time. Charlotte suggested they spend more time together beyond their designated married days. George was touched by her words. During the dance, George and Charlotte shared a joyful and united bond, delighting the Queen, who observed their happiness. George expressed to Charlotte that he could accomplish anything with her by his side. When learning that her husband had died, Agatha became elated and shared her happiness with her maid. However, she carried on playing the role of a mourning widow to the world. Fast forward to the year 1817. Agatha was conversing with a woman named Violet, apologizing for previously implying that Violet was fortunate despite grieving her husband. Agatha suggested establishing a school for orphans, emphasizing that her husband had a narrow view of women. She intended to seek vengeance through the school project. Charlotte pondered why her daughters were hesitant to marry. Brimsley eventually shared the truth, revealing that Charlotte's unwavering commitment to her husband had made her daughters reluctant to leave her. Charlotte became emotional and requested solitude. In 1761, Charlotte woke up in the middle of the night to find her husband sketching on the walls in a seemingly unconscious state. George then rushed to the garden, undressing completely. He claimed that Venus was speaking to him. Reynolds intervened to bring him back to his senses. Charlotte played along, calling herself Venus, and helped him back to their room, tending to him and asking Brimsley and Reynolds about her husband's condition, but they remained tight-lipped. In a flashback, the Mother Queen impressed upon George the importance of becoming a true king, especially after the war. She informed him that his bride would arrive on a ship, and upon hearing the word ship, George's demeanor changed. He began to experience familiar spasms. The Mother Queen promptly ordered her entourage to leave the room, leaving her alone with her son. She had embraced him as he collapsed into a fit. Following this episode, the Mother Queen consulted with the palace doctors, seeking medical solutions for her son's condition. Some suggested drastic measures like making a hole in his skull, while others proposed alternative solutions. The Mother Queen rejected these suggestions, demanding innovative ideas, especially with her son's wedding only a week away. But Dr. John, a neurologist, suggested different approaches to treating George's condition. Although the other doctors scoffed at him, John was determined to prove the effectiveness of his methods. He engaged George directly, looking into his eyes and reaffirming his role as king, emphasizing he could lead not just a kingdom but himself as well. George responded positively, expressing his readiness for marriage. The Queen became pleased with this swift progress and entrusted John with George's medical care. On the wedding day, when George learned that Charlotte had run away, his symptoms resurfaced, and he attempted to flee. However, John gave him a firm slap, jolting George back to his senses. The wedding proceeded as planned, and afterward, they returned to the palace, where they quarreled. George left Charlotte and retreated to the observatory with Reynolds. There, he confided in Reynolds, stating that he doesn't want Charlotte, whom he finds both beautiful and intelligent, to witness his illness, which prompted his desire to distance himself from her. Following Charlotte's arrival at George's palace, he remained silent, and Charlotte eventually left in frustration. Afterward, George sought out John and implored him to treat the root causes of his condition rather than just managing the seizures. John requested George's permission to employ his radical methods, which George willingly granted. John believed that George's problem stemmed from his lifelong experience as a king, accustomed to unquestioning obedience. He employed a series of extreme treatments, including waking George from sleep, submerging his face in an ice-filled bathtub, and using an electric chair. Reynolds expressed his dissatisfaction with John's methods, and George agreed but learned about no alternative. Reynolds encouraged George to get to know Charlotte better. Observing Charlotte from afar, George became fascinated by her intellect as he watched her play chess with herself. He decided to win her over by gifting her the dog, leading to a humorous exchange when Charlotte described the dog as a deformed rabbit. George informed John that he would live in the palace with Charlotte. The doctor expressed concern about the potential consequences and relapse of George's illness due to this change. George acknowledged that he hadn't made any progress in his treatment and attributed his healing journey to Charlotte. He reflected on his childhood, where everything was exaggerated, and he lived in fear of the consequences of his actions. Living with Charlotte has given him a sense of freedom, safety, and happiness, allowing him to do as he pleases without fear. Once George saw John in the kitchen preparing something for Charlotte the next day. John informed him that Charlotte was pregnant, and this news triggered George's symptoms once again. He resorted to drawing sketches on the walls and undressing in the garden. Charlotte attempted to calm him down and brought him back into the palace. The following day, George awoke to find his drawings on the wall and learned that Charlotte had discovered his illness. She rode to the Queen's palace to confront her. The Queen Mother defended George, emphasizing the immense burden he was carrying as the ruler of a vast country at a young age. She suggested that she, Charlotte, would have acted similarly if she were in her place. During their heated exchange, the Queen Mother emphasized that she would do anything to protect her son from collapsing. She revealed George's behavior of speaking to the sky, implying that he was deeply troubled. Unbeknownst to the two women, George overheard their conversation and became despondent. He sought out John and asked to be tied to a chair. Agatha had shared her deep sorrow about her husband's passing with her maid. She recounted how she had been betrothed to him from a very young age, and now that he was gone, she felt lost and uncertain about how to proceed with her life. The following day, Charlotte received unexpected news. The Queen had arranged for a doctor to confirm her pregnancy, and after the examination, it was indeed confirmed that Charlotte was expecting. The Queen couldn't contain her joy and decided to stay with Charlotte in the palace until the baby's birth. Charlotte was taken aback by this sudden turn of events and urgently penned a letter to George, asking Brimsley to deliver it. Brimsley entrusted the letter to Reynolds and made sure it reached George. However, when Reynolds arrived at George's palace, he was shocked by the distressing sounds of torture emanating from within. Knocking on the door, he found George in an exhausted state. John informed him that George was not available at the moment, taking the letter from Reynolds and placing it with the stack of other unread letters on the table. Meanwhile, Agatha's family visited her, expressing their concerns about her son's inheritance of the Lord's title after her husband's demise, much like how it happened in white families. Agatha was taken aback by this unexpected discussion, as she hadn't given this matter much thought before. Determined to take matters into her own hands, she headed to her husband's office in search of valuable information in the lawyer's letters, especially his address. In her husband's name, she signed a visitation permit that would allow her to meet with the lawyer and seek the answers she needed. Meanwhile, Charlotte had prepared for a drawing session with her husband, but she noticed his absence. Disappointed, she decided to draw alone. Her frustration grew when the Queen Mother requested the painter to make her skin complexion lighter, a request that bothered Charlotte deeply. In response to her growing unhappiness, Charlotte wrote a letter addressed to her brother and entrusted it to Brimsley. When he opened and read the letter, he discovered Charlotte's desire to leave the country. Brimsley confided in Reynolds about the letter and sought his advice on how to handle the situation. Reynolds advised that they had no choice but to send the letter to her brother. Meanwhile, Agatha needed some time alone and took a solitary walk on a piece of land until she grew tired and sat down. There, she unexpectedly encountered the landowner, Ledger, who struck up a conversation with her about land ownership. He suggested meeting again the following day for another walk, leaving Agatha's maid puzzled by her mistress's unusual behavior. In the year 1917, Charlotte took the initiative to search for suitable brides for her sons. Her sons, displeased with this decision, pleaded with the eldest, who was the crown prince, to annul the proposed marriages. Despite his mother's apology, the crown prince remained firm in his determination to proceed with the marriage. In 1761, Agatha continued her meetings with Ledger, emphasizing her preference for comfortable shoes during their walks. Her maid found Agatha's behavior increasingly puzzling. Charlotte's brother arrived at the palace, and she rushed to embrace him, sharing the news of her pregnancy. He was elated by the announcement. However, Charlotte confided in him that she was not happy about the pregnancy and expressed a desire to return to her homeland. Her brother gently explained that this was not possible, as she was now carrying the legitimate heir to the throne, and her body now belonged to Britain. Charlotte felt deeply saddened and frustrated by her brother's actions, believing that he had forced her into the marriage solely for the benefit of their country and as a political alliance with Britain. Meanwhile, Agatha opened up to Ledger about her recent husband's death, admitting that she felt no love or longing for him. Ledger shared a similar sentiment about his wife, creating a bond between them. However, just as their connection was growing stronger, Ledger suddenly withdrew and left. Upon her return to the palace, Agatha was confronted by her husband's lawyer, who delivered a shocking revelation. Her husband had deceived her about their financial situation, spending their savings on the palace, clothes, and servants, leaving her with nothing. Furthermore, the properties and lands she had been granted would be reclaimed by the palace. This revelation triggered a nervous attack in Agatha, leading her to vent her frustration by breaking her bed, feeling that her entire life had been wasted. Meanwhile, Charlotte, her brother, and the Queen Mother sat at the dinner table. Charlotte appeared distracted and upset. The Queen Mother announced her decision that after Charlotte's pregnancy, she would be free to choose whether or not to see her husband unless she wanted to become pregnant again. Charlotte was deeply hurt by this statement, left the table, and couldn't find solace even when Brimsley attempted to console her. Brimsley sought help from Reynolds, expressing concern about Charlotte's deteriorating condition and fearing a potential disaster in the palace. He requested assistance in bringing George to Charlotte's palace, but Reynolds adamantly refused to get involved. Upon his return to George's palace, Reynolds was horrified by the torture George was enduring during his treatment. He attempted to intervene but was ordered to leave the room by John. Agatha decided to take her young son to the Queen's palace. During their journey, she imparted to him the weight of their family's responsibility. In the Queen's presence, Agatha addressed her son as Lord, signifying his rightful title. However, the Queen did not acknowledge this title and mentioned that she had not yet decided on the inheritance of power within the Black community. Agatha left the palace with a heavy heart, but she reassured her son that they would persevere in their struggle as descendants of brave warriors. Meanwhile, Ledger embarked on a project to create a crown for Agatha's upcoming birthday. He declined his daughter's assistance, claiming it was a gift for a dear friend. Upon Agatha's return to her place, she was surprised to find Charlotte there. Charlotte revealed her reluctance to return to the palace. Agatha sent her maid to inquire about the Queen's whereabouts. During their conversation, Charlotte confided in Agatha about her troubles. Agatha, while stating that they were not friends, offered her support and advised her to remain strong in the face of difficulties. Charlotte expressed her gratitude and departed. Upon her return to the palace, Charlotte was horrified by the sight of her husband's torture and demanded that everyone, including the doctor, leave her husband immediately. There, Charlotte hugged her weakened husband and identified herself, placing his hand on her belly. She expelled John from her presence and asked Brimsley to move her belongings to John's place because she wanted to live with her husband. Ledger visited Agatha and presented her with the crown as a birthday gift. Agatha was deeply touched by the gesture, and they grew closer, spending intimate time together. Ledger visited Agatha and presented her with the crown as a birthday gift. Agatha was deeply touched by the gesture, and they grew closer, spending intimate time together. In a different timeline, in the year 1817, Violet visited Agatha and suggested they go for a walk. While Agatha was changing her clothes, Violet discovered the crown among Agatha's belongings, revealing that Ledjar was her father. As for Charleston, with her sons and daughters, they posed together for a portrait, presumably to have their family depicted in a drawing or painting. In 1761, when Charlotte entered George's palace and found him eating, she remarked that he seemed more like his normal self. He then told her that she needed to leave him because he feared he might harm her. Charlotte confessed that she had believed he was avoiding her because he saw a deficiency in her, but now she realized he was doing it to protect her from himself. She asked George if he loved her, which angered him, and he ordered her to leave. In defiance, Charlotte declared that she wouldn't abandon him and would do anything for him. She then confessed her love for him and pressured him until he brokenly admitted that he loved her, even from the moment he first saw her attempting to evade over the wall. George admitted that he couldn't bear to be without her, and Charlotte assured him that they would face everything together for each other. Meanwhile, Agatha was preparing to meet Ledgar, and when she encountered him, she was surprised and embarrassed to find his daughter with him. Their conversation remained formal as Agatha expressed her gratitude for everything Ledjar had done for her. Eventually, they parted ways. In 1817, Charlotte grew weary of long drawing sessions. Two of her children approached her, speaking on behalf of the others. They conveyed their feelings of being treated harshly by Charlotte, who constantly reminded them of their responsibility to get married and have children for her. Charlotte defended her actions, stating that she did it because she knew they were capable. Her son pointed out that she had never treated them as a mother, but rather as a queen, while her daughter expressed that she knew very little about them. Despite her reluctance to admit her faults, Charlotte deep down knew that she wanted to be a better mother. In the same year, 1761, Charlotte was sitting and working on an embroidery when her husband approached her, visibly happy. She informed him that a letter had arrived from his mother, who requested him to deliver a speech before the Parliament. George forcefully had torn the letter from Charlotte and revealed his desire to go to the farm instead of dealing with the Parliament and the letter from his mother. Concerned about George's potential relapse, Reynolds approached Charlotte and shared his worries. Charlotte, however, believed that George primarily needed her love, discipline, and distance from John to recover. Agatha paid a visit to the Queen's palace, where the Queen inquired about Charlotte. Agatha chose to withhold information about her newfound friendship with Charlotte. Upon returning home, Agatha's maid expressed concern about the crisis in the palace, as the nation was aware of the king's illness. The next day, the Queen visited Charlotte's palace, hoping to meet her son. However, George refused to see her. Instead, Charlotte met with the Queen and explained George's reluctance. The Queen stressed the importance of George's presence in the Parliament for maintaining order in the country and suggested that George belonged to her now. Touched by her mother-in-law's words, Charlotte persuaded George to return to the palace for the sake of the people. She reassured him that everything would be fine and held his hand as they entered the palace. Inside, Charlotte encountered Agatha and wished to confide in her about the events in the palace. However, she refrained from doing so. Charlotte offered her assistance with her duties, but Agatha hesitated before declining the offer, stating that their friendship was sufficient. As she left the palace, Agatha crossed paths with Charlotte's brother, who seemed to take an interest in her. Ledjar offered to meet Agatha at her home, and she agreed to marry him to resolve her problems. Meanwhile, Charlotte entered George's chamber and found him preparing the speech he would deliver before the Parliament. She noticed his anxiety, but reassured him. Suddenly, Charlotte experienced labor pains, signaling that it was time for the birth. The doctor was summoned, and George expressed his desire to be with her during the birth. However, the priest refused, deeming it a women's matter and inappropriate for men to be present. George reluctantly acquiesced to the priest's decision. After some time, Agatha emerged from Charlotte's delivery room and conveyed to George that Charlotte wished for him to be present during the birth. George expressed his determination to enter, even threatening to remove the priest from his position if he obstructed his entrance. He joined Charlotte and was surprised to learn that the baby was in a breech position. The doctor instructed Charlotte to push, and George offered warm support by holding her hand. Eventually, a healthy baby boy was born. George held his son, kissed him, and proudly showed him to the Mother Queen, who had missed the birth. Outside the palace, Agatha was walking with Charlotte's brother when she spotted Ledyard in the distance. Inside the palace, Agatha was in the company of the Queen Mother, who repeatedly asked for information about Charlotte. Agatha remained silent, and the Queen Mother applied pressure, stating that she wouldn't grant her son the title if Agatha continued to withhold information. Overwhelmed, Agatha began to cry, prompting the Queen to share her own story of overcoming difficulties with her father-in-law to secure her son's ascension to the throne. Agatha agreed to assist the Queen Mother with the matter of inheritance in exchange for information about Charlotte. Meanwhile, George was preparing for his speech and appeared nervous. Charlotte approached him, offering words of encouragement and assuring him that he would impress the audience. Grateful for her support, George left for the Parliament. However, during the carriage ride to the Parliament, George became increasingly anxious, and symptoms of his illness resurfaced. He refused to leave the carriage, leaving Reynolds to inform Charlotte of the situation. Charlotte was surprised by the sudden change, as George had appeared normal the last time she saw him. George, frustrated, admitted that his previous appearance was a facade and that he couldn't control his condition. Inside the room, Charlotte found George hiding under the bed, claiming he was afraid of the sky and hiding from it. Charlotte tried to comfort him, assuring him that his next performance would be better. George, however, believed he would never improve and insisted that Charlotte should leave him because he was sick and abnormal. Charlotte refused, professing her love for him and vowing never to abandon him. Charlotte proposed that instead of George going to the Parliament, he should bring the Parliament to the palace for added convenience and security. Meanwhile, Charlotte's brother paid a visit to Agatha and expressed his intention to marry her and take her to his country. Agatha was left speechless, uncertain of how to respond to this unexpected proposal. Back at the palace, the parliamentarian inquired about George's whereabouts, but discovered that the Mother Queen was unaware of his location. The Mother Queen asserted her dominance in the kingdom, claiming she knew everything about the party. In the palace garden, Agatha felt anxious about Charlotte's brother's proposal. Her maid advised her to accept it as a solution to her financial problems, but Agatha became angry and dismissed her. Charlotte prepared for the party, and George admired her beauty. Despite his trembling, he tried to touch her face, but Charlotte gently took his hand and guided him outside for the festivities. George felt unwell, especially around the people, but Charlotte reassured him, asking him to smile and focus only on her eyes. They danced together, and he found solace in her presence. Afterward, George delivered his speech, expressing gratitude and happiness for the arrival of their son into the world. They danced again, sharing a deep sense of joy and connection. Charlotte's brother approached Agatha and spoke about the beauty of his country, suggesting that she would be happy there and have many children. Agatha, however, became worried and explained that she couldn't marry him because she was already married, and expressed her desire to live for herself without the burden of living for someone else. In 1817, Charlotte reflected on one of the paintings in which she appeared with her children. Her son approached her and shared the news that his wife was expecting a baby. Charlotte was filled with joy and hugged her son, a rare display of affection that made him feel a bit awkward, but he hugged her back. In 1761, the Mother Queen had a heartfelt conversation with Charlotte, expressing that all her life she had wanted her son to find happiness, and he had ultimately found it with Charlotte. She bid Charlotte farewell and departed, Following this, Charlotte spoke with Agatha, expressing her knowledge of the problems Agatha was facing. She conveyed her frustration and disappointment that Agatha hadn't confided in her about these issues. Agatha explained that she didn't want to burden Charlotte with her problems. In response, Charlotte encouraged Agatha to return to the palace and present her problems to George, who would help find solutions. She promised to assist Agatha in resolving her difficulties. Then, Charles went to George and shared the news that she was pregnant for the second time. George was overjoyed to hear this news, showing his happiness and anticipation for their growing family. In 1817, Charlotte arrived at George's palace and asked Brimsley to wait for her outside. She entered the chamber and found her husband engrossed in drawing on the wall, making it difficult to capture his attention with words. In response, Charlotte went under the bed and George followed her. There, she shared the news that their son was going to be a father, and they would soon have a grandchild, preserving their lineage. George thanked her for everything she had done for him and his people, expressing his appreciation and love.